The palace corridors were nearly empty after midnight. Only council guards remained outside the western wing, while distant music from the royal banquet echoed faintly through the marble halls. Celine Vale walked quietly toward the private council chamber, carrying a stack of signed documents against her chest. The Alpha King had asked for them personally. An hour earlier, he had stood in her chambers, adjusting the silver clasp on her sleeve, before pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "Don't stay awake waiting for me," he had murmured. Celine almost smiled, remembering it. Almost. Because the moment she reached the chamber doors, everything changed. "You actually thought I'd choose her?" Laughter exploded from inside the room. Celine stopped instantly. The voice belonged to the Alpha King. Inside, another councilman laughed harder. "She's that attached?" "She's useful," the Alpha King replied casually. "Loyal. Quiet. Easy to manage." More laughter followed. Celine's fingers tightened slowly around the documents. A third voice joined in. "And she thinks you care about her?" The Alpha King answered without hesitation. "That's what makes it convenient." Silence crashed through Celine, harder than shouting ever could. Because only an hour ago, he had touched her like she mattered. Now he was discussing her like furniture in a room full of men. The councilman laughed again. "You really kept her believing she had a future beside you?" "She believes what I allow her to believe." Something cold settled inside Celine's chest. Not heartbreak. Not even anger. Clarity. Complete and immediate. Inside the chamber, glasses clinked together while conversation moved on casually, as though nothing cruel had just happened. As though she were too insignificant to deserve caution. Celine looked once at the closed chamber doors, then lowered her gaze to the royal documents in her hands. Carefully, quietly. She stepped backward into the shadows before anyone inside noticed she had ever been there. No confrontation, no tears, no trembling breakdown in the hallway. Just silence. The kind that arrives when trust dies too suddenly for emotion to catch up. Then Celine turned away from the chamber doors and walked down the corridor alone, already knowing she would not still be inside this palace by sunrise. The council chamber doors opened moments later. Celine had almost reached the end of the corridor when footsteps sounded behind her. "Celine?" She stopped walking. The Alpha King approached with relaxed confidence still lingering from the council meeting, dark formal coat hanging loosely over his shoulders. Then he noticed her expression. Or rather, the lack of one. "You're awake late," he said. Celine lifted the documents slightly. "You asked for these." His gaze dropped to the folder in her hands. "You could have left them with the servants." "Yes," she replied calmly. "I could have." Something subtle shifted in his eyes at her tone. The Alpha King stepped closer. "How long have you been standing here?" "Not long." Another answer that wasn't really an answer. Behind him, muffled laughter still echoed faintly from inside the chamber. Celine noticed him glance briefly toward the sound, then back to her. And suddenly, he understood enough to become cautious. "You heard something?" The question came carefully now, measured. Celine held his gaze for one quiet second before placing the documents into his hands. The movement forced him to take them automatically. Neither of them spoke immediately afterward. The Alpha King searched her expression closely, waiting for anger, accusation, anything emotional enough to fix. But Celine only looked tired. That unsettled him more. Finally, he lowered his voice. "Whatever was said in there, Good night, Your Majesty." She stepped around him before he could finish. The Alpha King turned immediately. "Celine." She paused this time, but didn't face him. The corridor lanterns cast long shadows across the marble floor between them. "I meant what I said earlier tonight," he said carefully. That almost made her laugh. Not because it was funny, because suddenly she realized he probably believed that was true. Celine spoke quietly, without turning around. "Did you?" Silence answered first. "A mistake. Small, but fatal." Behind them, another councilman exited the chamber carrying a glass of wine before stopping awkwardly at the sight of them standing there. His expression changed instantly when he noticed Celine. Then guilt flashed across his face far too clearly. The Alpha King noticed that too. Everything sharpened afterward. Celine finally continued walking down the corridor. This time, he didn't stop her. He only stood there, holding the document she brought him, while unease settled slowly into his chest for reasons he couldn't fully explain yet. At the end of the hallway, Celine disappeared around the corner without looking back once. And somehow, that bothered him far more than anger would have. Celine packed quietly. The palace slept around her, while candlelight flickered softly across the walls of her chambers. No servants. No guards. No interruptions. Exactly how she wanted it. She folded clothes neatly into a small travel bag before fastening the straps tightly closed. 1 cloak. 2 dresses. Coin pouch. Knife. Nothing sentimental. Nothing heavy enough to slow her down. The rain outside had already started. Soft at first. Steady enough to cover sound. Good. Celine crossed slowly toward the vanity mirror near the window. The silver necklace the Alpha King gifted her during winter rested against her throat. She stared at it for several silent seconds, then removed it carefully and placed it on the table beside the candle. No note beneath it. No dramatic farewell. If he wanted explanations, he could remember his own words. A quiet knock interrupted the silence. "My lady?" A young maid called nervously through the chamber doors. Celine opened them halfway. The maid blinked in surprise at the sight of the travel bag. "You're leaving?" "Yes." "At this hour?" "Yes." The girl hesitated visibly. "Should I inform His Majesty?" Celine adjusted the strap over her shoulder calmly. "No." The maid lowered her voice carefully. "Did something happen?" For a moment, Celine almost answered honestly. Instead, she simply said, "I finally heard the truth." The girl looked confused, but wisely didn't ask more questions. Celine stepped past her into the corridor. "Wait," the maid whispered suddenly. Celine stopped. The girl looked nervous now. "Will you come back?" That question settled strangely inside the silence between them. Celine glanced once toward the royal wing far beyond the palace halls. Toward the private chamber, where men laughed about loyalty they didn't respect. Then she answered honestly, "No." The maid inhaled sharply. But before she could speak again, Celine disappeared down the servants' staircase leading toward the southern stables. By the time dawn approached, 1 horse was missing. So was she. The south gate guards barely noticed the cloaked rider leaving through the rain before sunrise. No escort. No royal banner. No intention of returning. An hour later, a maid entered Celine's chambers carrying fresh linens. Then froze. The untouched bed. The extinguished candles. The empty wardrobe. Panic arrived instantly. She ran toward the royal floor without stopping once. "My king." The Alpha King looked up from his desk impatiently. "What is it?" The maid's voice shook. "Lady Selene is gone." Silence followed immediately. Then the Alpha King stood, fast enough to overturn his chair. "Gone where?" The Alpha King's voice cut sharply across the royal study. The maid flinched immediately. We don't know, Your Majesty." "She always walks the lower gardens at dawn," he said impatiently. "Not today." Silence stretched tightly through the room. Then the maid added carefully, "Her traveling cloak is missing." Something cold moved through him instantly. The Alpha King crossed the study in seconds. The stables. Servants and guards scattered from his path as he moved through the palace corridors. By the time he reached the lower courtyard, stable hands were already waiting nervously beside the empty stall. "One horse gone, my king," a guard reported quickly. "Which one?" "The gray southern mare." "Fast." "Endurance trained." Selene chose carefully. The realization sharpened his expression immediately. "When?" "Before dawn." Another guard approached, holding a ledger. "Southgate records show passage clearance just before sunrise." "She left alone?" "Yes." The Alpha King grabbed the ledger from his hand and read the entry himself. No escort listed. No destination. Just departure. Intentional. A councilman hurried into the courtyard moments later, robes half-fastened from being summoned too quickly. "Your Majesty, the Eastern delegation arrives within the hour." "Cancel it." The courtyard went completely still. The councilman blinked. "Cancel diplomacy?" "I said cancel it." "But over a servant born?" The Alpha King looked up slowly. The man stopped speaking immediately. Because for the first time that morning, something dangerous had entered the king's expression. "She heard us," he said quietly. No one answered. No one needed to. The councilman swallowed hard. What exactly did she hear? The Alpha King didn't respond immediately, because suddenly he remembered every word too clearly. Useful, quiet, easy to manage. That's what makes it convenient. A mistake. Not the conversation. The arrogance of believing she would never hear it. A scout approached quickly from the outer gates. "Your Majesty, orders?" The Alpha King snapped back immediately. "Search every southern road and river crossing." "How far out?" "As far as necessary." The scout hesitated briefly. "If she crossed toward Eastern territory..." "She won't." But even saying it, he wasn't fully certain anymore. Because Selene hadn't left emotionally. She had left decisively. That was different. The Alpha King mounted his horse moments later while rain clouds gathered heavily over the capital. 4 royal guards assembled behind him instantly. The councilman called after him desperately, "Your Majesty, this is becoming politically reckless." The Alpha King grabbed the reins tightly. "No," he said coldly. "What's reckless is letting her disappear after hearing what she did." Then he drove the horse forward hard enough to spray mud across the courtyard stone, and rode straight toward the southern forest roads. Rain hammered the forest roads by midday. Selene kept riding anyway. Mud splashed beneath the mare's hooves, while cold wind cut through the soaked edges of her traveling cloak. She barely noticed anymore. Her thoughts were louder than the storm. She's useful, easy to manage. That's what makes it convenient. The words replayed relentlessly in her mind. Not exaggerated by emotion, not twisted by anger, simply remembered exactly as they were spoken. That was the worst part. There had been no hesitation in his voice. No guilt. Only confidence. As if her loyalty had become something predictable enough to mock safely behind closed doors. Celine tightened her grip on the reins slightly. Ahead, the forest road split around the river cliffs, leading toward the borderlands. Most travelers avoided the eastern routes during storm season. Too dangerous. Too isolated. Good. That meant fewer people asking questions. By evening, the rain worsened hard enough to force her off the main road entirely. The abandoned border outpost appeared through the storm shortly afterward. Half-collapsed stone walls beside the old eastern crossing. Celine guided the horse beneath the broken shelter roof before finally dismounting. Her legs ached immediately from hours of riding. The mare breathed heavily beside her, while thunder rolled somewhere deeper across the mountains. For the first time since leaving the palace, Celine allowed herself to stop moving. Silence settled around her, except for rain striking the old stone roof overhead. Then the exhaustion arrived all at once. Not physical, emotional, because now there was nothing left distracting her from the truth. The Alpha King never truly saw her as equal to him. Maybe he cared in his own way. Maybe he even believed he did. But respect and convenience were not the same thing. And somewhere along the line, he stopped recognizing the difference. Celine leaned briefly against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes. No tears came. Only clarity. She would never return to a place where affection existed privately while disrespect survived publicly. A distant sound interrupted her thoughts suddenly. Hoofbeats. Approaching fast through the storm. Celine's hand moved instantly beneath her cloak toward the knife hidden at her side. The rider emerged moments later through the rain-covered road ahead. Not royal black armor. Silver. Eastern markings. Enemy territory. The horse slowed several feet away while its rider removed dark leather gloves carefully. Then looked directly at her. Alpha King Rhaegor Vire. Celine straightened immediately. Rhaegor studied her once before speaking. Wrong border, she said first. He glanced briefly at the storm around them. Doesn't seem like you care much about borders tonight. Rainwater dripped steadily from the broken roof of the abandoned border post. Rhaegor remained mounted for several silent seconds, studying Celine through the storm. Not casually. Carefully. Like he was assembling conclusions faster than she could hide them. Celine kept one hand near the knife beneath her cloak. Rhaegor noticed immediately. You won't need that unless you plan to stab me first. That depends. A faint amusement touched his expression. Good answer. He finally dismounted, boots splashing lightly into the mud below. Even soaked by rain, he carried himself with unsettling control. Nothing rushed. Nothing careless. Celine recognized that type of man instantly. Dangerous because he rarely wasted movement. Rhaegor tied the horse loosely beneath the shelter before turning back toward her. You left quietly, he observed. Yes. That usually means someone spoke too loudly. The words landed hard enough that Celine looked away automatically. Mistake. Because his gaze sharpened immediately. There it is, he said quietly. Celine crossed her arms defensively. There's what? The reason you're standing at my border during a storm instead of inside a palace. Silence stretched between them. Rhaegor leaned lightly against the old stone wall nearby. You're not frightened, he continued calmly. You're done. That was worse somehow. Because it was accurate. Celine finally asked, Why are you here? Border inspection. In the middle of a storm? Rhaegor shrugged once. I dislike delegating important things. She almost smiled despite herself. Almost. The storm cracked loudly overhead again, while cold wind swept rain through the broken structure around them. Rhaegor watched her carefully for another moment before speaking again. Who laughed at you? Selene froze. Not visibly enough for most people to notice, but enough for him. His expression changed slightly afterward. Not pity. Understanding. That bad? She answered quietly. Bad enough. Rhaegor nodded slowly, like that confirmed something he already suspected. The ones who leave silently usually heard the truth too clearly to argue with it. Selene stared at him. You say that like experience. I say it like observation. Another silence settled. Then, hoofbeats thundered violently through the rain outside. Fast. Urgent. Multiple riders. Rhaegor turned toward the road first. Selene already knew who it was before the black royal horse burst through the storm beyond the outpost. The Alpha King dismounted before the horse fully stopped. His eyes found Selene instantly. Relief appeared across his face first. Then tension once he noticed who stood beside her. Selene. Her posture stiffened automatically. Rhaegor stayed exactly where he was, watching both of them carefully while rain poured heavily between the three rulers of this moment. The man who lost her, the woman who left, and the rival who arrived first. The storm quieted slightly around the abandoned border post. Rain still fell hard enough to blur the forest road behind them, but the thunder had moved farther into the mountains. No one spoke immediately. The Alpha King looked at Selene like he still expected this situation to become temporary if he said the correct thing quickly enough. Rhaegor noticed that first. Selene noticed it too. Come back, the Alpha King said finally. Selene answered immediately. No. The response came so fast, his expression shifted, as though he hadn't fully prepared himself for refusal. We need to talk. You already did. Silence hit hard. Rhaegor folded his arms loosely against the stone wall nearby, while watching the realization move slowly across the Alpha King's face. You heard the council chamber. Selene almost laughed at how carefully he phrased it now, as though softer wording changed what happened. Yes. The Alpha King stepped closer. You weren't supposed to hear that. That finally made her smile. Not kindly. You think that's the problem? It wasn't serious. You laughed. The words cut cleanly through the rain between them. The Alpha King stopped moving entirely, because there was no defense against that part. Selene looked at him steadily now. No one forced those words out of you, she said quietly. No one misunderstood you. You meant every sentence. That's not true. Then which part was false? Another silence answered her. Fatal. Rhaegor watched the exchange with growing interest now. Not because of conflict. Because of clarity. The Alpha King lowered his voice carefully. Selene, listen to me. No. For the first time, frustration sharpened visibly across his face. You're leaving over private words said in one conversation? Selene shook her head once. I'm leaving because those private words were honest. Nothing answered immediately afterward. Not even the rain seemed loud enough to interrupt what settled there. Because he couldn't deny it. Not truly. Rhaegor finally stepped slightly forward beside her. She crossed into my border an hour ago, he said calmly. The Alpha King's gaze snapped toward him instantly. "Stay out of this." Rhaegor barely reacted. "Then you should have arrived first." The tension shifted sharply after that. Not physical. Worse. Final. The Alpha King looked back toward Selene again, and this time something different entered his expression. Not confidence. Not authority. Fear. Because for the first time since finding her, he understood she was no longer waiting for reassurance. And without that, he had nothing left capable of stopping her from leaving. Rainwater slid steadily from the edges of the broken border roof, while silence stretched tightly between them. The Alpha King looked at Selene carefully now. Not like someone managing a situation anymore. Like someone realizing control had already slipped away. "You're seriously leaving over this?" he asked quietly. Selene adjusted the strap of her travel bag higher onto her shoulder. "No." A pause. "I'm leaving because now I know what staying meant to you." The words landed visibly. Rhaegor remained silent beside her, arms folded loosely while watching the exchange unfold. The Alpha King stepped closer again. "You know I care about you." Selene met his gaze steadily. "That's not the same thing as respecting me." Another silence followed. Longer this time. Because he knew she was right. Somewhere behind him, the royal guards shifted uneasily in the rain. Even they understood what this conversation had become. Not about betrayal. About dignity. "You're overreacting," the Alpha King tried again, softer now. Men talk carelessly in private sometimes. Rhaegor laughed once under his breath. Low, disbelieving. The Alpha King shot him a sharp look. "Something amusing?" "Yes," Rhaegor replied calmly. Selene glanced sideways at him briefly. Rhaegor looked back toward the Alpha King. "You still think this is about the conversation? Then enlighten me." "She's leaving because she finally heard your honest opinion when you thought she wasn't listening." That silenced everyone, including the guards. The Alpha King looked back toward Selene immediately. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" "You know what I meant." "No," she replied quietly. "I know exactly what you said." The storm began easing slowly around them, rain softening into mist drifting through the border trees. Selene looked toward the eastern road, disappearing into unfamiliar territory beyond the outpost. Unknown land. Unknown future. But at least it was honest. Rhaegor finally spoke directly to her. "Decision made?" The Alpha King turned sharply toward her at the same moment. "Waven. For hesitation. For weakness. For history to pull harder than humiliation." Selene looked once at the man she had spent years loving quietly, then remembered the sound of his laughter behind closed doors. Not cruel laughter. Worse, comfortable laughter. The kind people use when they believe someone's loyalty is guaranteed, no matter how poorly they're treated. That was what ended things. Not anger. Certainty. Selene looked back toward Rhaegor calmly. "Yes," she said. The Alpha King inhaled sharply. "Selene." But she was already turning away from him before he finished speaking. And, for the first time, he understood he might not be able to stop her. The storm finally broke apart as dawn light spread slowly across the eastern mountains. Mist drifted through the forest roads while cold wind carried the scent of rain-soaked pine across the borderlands. Selene walked beside Rhaegor without speaking. Behind them, the Alpha King still stood beneath the abandoned outpost roof, watching, not following, because even he understood some distances could no longer be crossed by force. The eastern road curved ahead through rising cliffs and dark woods unfamiliar to her. Unknown territory. Unknown future. Yet, strangely, Celine felt lighter with every step away from the capital. Rhaegor glanced sideways at her after several minutes of silence. "You didn't hesitate. I already did that before leaving." That answer sounds practiced. It's exhausted. A faint trace of understanding crossed his expression. The guards, following several yards behind, wisely kept their distance. No one interrupted. No one rushed her. For the first time in years, nobody expected her to quietly remain where she was placed. Back at the border, the Alpha King finally mounted his horse again. Celine heard it faintly through the trees. The sound made her slow slightly. Rhaegor noticed immediately. Second thoughts? No. She looked ahead again, just realizing it's actually over. Rhaegor nodded once. Most endings happen long before people admit them aloud. That settled heavily inside her chest because it was true. The relationship hadn't ended in the council chamber. It ended the moment respect disappeared, while affection remained convenient enough to fake privately. Celine exhaled slowly. "I think part of me knew before tonight." Rhaegor looked mildly curious. "Then why stay?" She answered honestly. "Because loyalty makes people hopeful long after they should stop waiting." Silence followed thoughtfully. Then Rhaegor said quietly, and hearing the truth ended the waiting. "Yes." The eastern fortress appeared faintly ahead through the thinning mist. Dark stone towers rising against the mountains. A new beginning she never planned for. Rhaegor slowed slightly beside her. "You understand people will talk." They already did. "That doesn't bother you?" Celine almost smiled. "No," she replied calmly. "Not anymore." Far behind them, the Alpha King finally turned his horse back toward the capital. Alone. And somewhere in the quiet distance between them, he finally understood the one thing power could never guarantee. Loyalty survives hardship, but it does not survive humiliation once truth removes the illusion protecting it. Celine never looked back again, because the hardest step had already happened. The moment she walked away from the door, where she heard exactly what she meant to him, and exactly what she never would again.